Don't forget to preheat your oven, and to do that, we're going to hit bake. We're baking it at 425 today. We're gonna adjust it up to 425. And we're gonna hit start. If you don't hit start and preheat doesn't come on, it'll beep at you a few times to know that you need to do that. So preheat your oven to start 425. Today we are going to be making buttermilk biscuits, a classic that's super easy to make at home with limited ingredients and always a favorite. You can serve these with something sweet, or you could also do a biscuits and gravy and make them savory. So the first thing I'm doing today is I'm going to measure out my dry ingredients, okay? Remember that dry ingredients always get measured with dry measuring cups, okay? So when I measured this out, I made sure that I overfilled it and then leveled it off with the flat edge of the butter knife, okay? So 1 cup of flour goes in there. We're using 2 different chemical leaveners today, right? Our baking soda and baking powder as well. So we're gonna be using both of them. To measure your leavening ingredients here, you're gonna do a very similar technique that we just did on the flour. You're going to stick your measuring spoon into the container and you're gonna level it off using the edge of the container there. So a teaspoon of baking powder and then 1/8 of a teaspoon of baking soda, which we learned last week can also be called a pinch or a dash. I'm just gonna fill up my 1/4 teaspoon about halfway and then put that in there as well. We need some salt here, so just a dash of salt for flavor. And last but not least, a couple tablespoons of sugar. Remember, your flour and your sugar are at your station, so you just want to level that off before you add it in. We're gonna start off by whisking all these ingredients together. So we're gonna take our whisk and we're gonna make sure that those are all equally combined so that when we make our dough, we don't have just one piece of the dough having a ton of the leavener or the sugar. Now we're ready to move on to cutting in our fat. To cut in our solid fat or saturated fat, we're using butter today. We're gonna use a grater. And we don't just wanna melt this in, we actually wanna create little butter pockets all throughout the dough so that when we hit it in the oven and get it nice and warmed up, we're gonna make sure that the butter doesn't melt until it gets into the heat. So that's also gonna come into handy when we're working with the dough. We wanna make sure that we don't overwork it and melt this butter down. This is a trick that I learned a couple years ago, and you use frozen butter and then a grater. Now remember, graters are very sharp, so when you get down to a kind of uncomfortable section, you're just gonna wanna take that and either cut it with a knife or just kind of use your fingers to break it up. And remember to get all the butter from the inside of the grater as well. We're gonna take this and we're gonna combine it with our dry ingredients using a milling technique. So if you rub your thumb up against the backs of your fingertips, you'll get the technique that we're going to be kind of using to keep all the butter separate, and we're just coating it right now in those dry ingredients. We want to keep the butter, like we said, into these little kind of pea-shaped sizes so that when we bake it and the heat hits it, the steam that the butter creates is where we get our layers of our biscuit from. Don't overmix that, just get it mixed in to where all the butter is coated in the flour. All right, next we're gonna be measuring out our buttermilk, and we wanna remember that that very bottom line is a 1/4 cup. So I'm gonna set that on a flat surface, right? And shoppers, you're gonna be doing this up front. And then I'm just going to slowly pour my buttermilk in because I know it's not a ton. Check it at what level? Eye level, to make sure that we have a 1/4 cup. Excellent. And then I'm also gonna measure out 2 additional tablespoons in there as well. So I'm just gonna use my tablespoon, very slowly pour it in and dump it into that same liquid measuring cup. Now I'm ready to add my liquid ingredient, my buttermilk, to my dry ingredients and butter mixture. So the first thing I'm gonna do is form a well. And all that really means, you guys, is that you're forming a little hole in the center. And I'm gonna use a fork to combine these ingredients. I just find that it's easy to not overwork it when you're using a fork. So I'm gonna pour my buttermilk into the center of my well, and then I'm going to just swirl my fork around until the dough starts to come together into one large clump. Now the moisture tends to get stuck in the center, so you can kind of smash the dough a little bit with your fork to try and get all of that out of there. So once you have a pretty good solid dough here, see how it's all able to stick together, we're ready to move on to our next part, which will be combining this, folding it, and turning it to create these extra layers of flake for our biscuit. So I'm gonna dump the excess flour onto the countertop. I'm gonna also just clean up a little bit. Remember to clean as you go, okay? So we're gonna get rid of anything that we don't need anymore so that I have lots of room to roll out my dough today. You guys are gonna be using a rolling pin, and we'll go over a few different how-tos with that as well. Okay, so you wanna make sure that you have a little bit of flour down, so it would probably be a good idea to take that same measuring cup that you measured out your flour first, fill it up a little bit with just a tiny bit of flour, and dust both sides before you start. You just want the dough to barely come together when you get to this step, okay? So you want it to be in a rectangle, okay? And we're gonna fold this like an envelope. So center, center. And then when you're using your rolling pin, you wanna make sure you flour your pin here, okay? And you wanna make sure that you're not bulldozing it forward, that you're just using the weight of the pin to kind of flatten out what you started. So I have a rectangle again, so I'm gonna fold it into thirds again. So center towards the center. We're gonna do this one more time. And if your dough starts to stick like mine is, then that means it's time to reflour your pin or reflour the dough that you're rolling out. Okay, so we're gonna fold in, and roll. Now, lots of different ways you can cut biscuits. You can use an actual biscuit cutter. You could also, what we like to use are just our glasses in our station. So just your plastic glass found in your station. I just dip the edges in a little bit of the flour, and I start from the edge and I work my way around. This should make 4 to 6 biscuits, okay? You want them to be about a 1/2 inch thick, your dough here, okay, before you cut it. So you can kind of eyeball that, but you want them to all be the same thickness. Why do you think you would want them to be all the same thickness? Think about our knife cuts the other day. And then I'm just gonna kind of use my hands to get the rest of this patted out. Do it again. Okay. I might be able to get 2 out of this. Let's see. We got 1 there, and I'll probably just do a free-formed one with my last one here. All right, I'll show you these next steps to baking your biscuits in 2 seconds. All right, I've transferred my biscuits that I've cut onto a parchment sheet lined baking sheet. I have 1 tablespoon of buttermilk and a pastry brush that I'm going to just take. I also did a little thumb indent on each of the biscuits to help with the cooking process. And then I'm just gonna take my 1 tablespoon of buttermilk and I'm gonna brush each one You can dust with a little additional sugar if you like. The buttermilk's just gonna help with color, browning, okay, and keeping these nice and beautiful when they come out of the oven. All right, so we are going to transfer these now to our preheated oven, 425, for about 15 minutes, but you need to set a timer halfway through just to always check. All ovens are different, so you want to make sure that you're baking them and you're watching them at the same time and not just trusting that, okay? Your nose can be a great indicator also of when the biscuits are about ready. Make sure you wear an oven mitt when you transfer these into the oven.